Hi, guys. Thank you for tuning in to GNG live show, Gil and Gurpreet's live show. It's good to be back. I did take almost, I think, a couple of months off from doing the live for personal reasons, but we're back and we're kicking it off with a very powerful topic. And if you're tuning in for the first time, just to let you know, GNG stands for Gil, Gurpreet, and our show's all about HR and employee experience. Gil is an employee experience expert, though he doesn't like to be called the expert. And his company is called Employee Experience, and that's the address, www.employeeexperience.ca. I'm Gurpreet, and I also don't like to be called an expert, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm an HR professional and I run my own consulting company, HR Superhero, and that is the address to my website. So today we're going to kick off with a powerful topic on how much power does HR really have? And both Gail and I had this discussion last week, and we thought this was a fitting topic to have our comeback with because tons of discussions been happening around this topic, offline, online. And so we thought it was really important to kind of get into this topic so that we can have open discussions about this. Now, keep in mind, just a disclaimer, we're not trying to state that we know it all when it comes to how much power HR has. This is based on just our perspective, our own personal experiences working in the corporate world. So keep that in mind when we're going through this discussion. And you're more than welcome to join this discussion by typing in your comments below, and we will read them as we go through this show. So to kick it off, as always, I always like Gil to start. So Gil.
How much power does HR really have?
Mm-hmm.
I'll probably give an answer that might be a little disappointing to some, but the answer is it depends. It depends because it is truly an organization by organization outcome for HR based on how much power they are, to end up how much power they have. So what I'd like to talk about a little bit is more of what are some of the determining factors of how much power HR really has. And then we can talk a little bit about where does that power lie? Because from my experience with the organizations that I've worked with, the amount of HR has depends on the structure of the organization. It depends on how much power was given to them when the organization was built. Are there different measures, different levers that can then change that from where that is? Absolutely. But it all starts with what was the frame of mind when creating the HR function within the organization? Because if it was an HR function that was built entirely around compliance, around administration, because that's what a lot of leaders believe HR is entirely, then that's where the power that they're going to start with. Whereas if you have a leader, an executive, a founder, a CEO who believes in the possibilities around people strategy, believes that an HR leader, a people leader, a talent leader needs to be empowered, need to have authority, needs to have autonomy in their work, then they could have a tremendous amount of power. So that's where it starts. It starts with the power that they're given. From there, it is up to the HR person that determines what kind of influence they have moving forward. Because I've met plenty of HR people who were put in a lesser situation, we'll call it, but they were able to overcome that by demonstrating the value, demonstrating that a different way of thinking added value. Whereas other people stayed to script, they worked to rule, so to speak, were given a job description, lived up to that job description, and ultimately HR didn't have so much power. What's your take on that, Gurpreet?
I agree with you. I think it's, honestly speaking, so many factors go into it, and it's also situational based. So like me and you were talking about this last week. So for example, when I say situational, I'm going to give a perfect example. Let's talk about termination. Um, Now, if a hiring manager has decided they want to terminate somebody, yes, I can have a discussion with them, walk them through, pros and cons, and let's have open discussion. Why do you want to terminate? Maybe we shouldn't be terminating, and so on. But the ultimate decision does lie with the manager, right? Same thing with hiring. How much power does HR really have when it comes to hiring? Now, yes, when we're screening candidates, ultimately we have the power because we're screening the candidates and we're shortlisting the candidates. So shortlisting candidates, yes, but hiring again goes back to the hiring manager, right? They have all the power. They would take into consideration what we have to say as we met with the candidates and our feedback, but then ultimate decision then goes back to the hiring manager to decide. So then that power then again lies with them. But I saw a lot of comments on your post about this, which was a lot of great insights. And it's true also in a sense on HR's position in the company. How are they valued? How are they seen? And biggest thing I've seen in my career is the power also ultimately lies with, do you have a seat on the table? If you demanded the seat on the table, then you don't have power. But if you were invited, like many times I've been invited to sit at the table with the other managers and executives and stuff, when you're invited to sit on the table, that's because they value you. And then when they value you and then you have an input, then your input gets considered into it. So me personally, now that I work with CEOs as a consultant, that's my target base and that's who I work with. I can't say I have 100% power, but I do have some power to influence the CEO, the presidents, the executives on their decision making. So I'm influencing them based on pros and cons, so they can make a sound decision that's good for them and their employees. So I agree with you. I think it is heavily dependent on situations and your presence and your relationships with the people you work with.
So there's a lot to go through there in your comments, and I really appreciate it. I think the one that I really want to start with, though, is when you're talking around influence, because that is ultimately the biggest area that most HR leaders have power, is in their influence over others. Because ultimately, it is the CEO, it is the CFO, the COO, whomever else that's going to be making the decisions about their areas.
Yeah.
And if you're effective in selling these ideas and selling them on the value of looking at things from a people perspective, looking at things from an experience perspective, then you'll be able to help them change their behaviors. But ultimately, you're not going to have the authority over them to tell them one way or the other what they can do in their areas. One story I did want to talk about with you, though, was I believe you had mentioned a story from earlier in your career where an HR leader did actually veto a person that was looking to fire somebody. I believe you had told the story a while back where there was a person, a manager who wanted to fire a person completely unfairly.
Yeah.
You stood up to it. And ultimately, it went up to a director,
Yeah.
VP, who then did have the authority, because that's one of the things that there's a difference between how much power does HR have versus how much power should HR have.
Yeah.
And that's a very different question, because if HR sees a leader, sees a manager doing something that's a detriment to the company, firing somebody in a way that it is bad for the company, they shouldn't be fired. They shouldn't be fired in the way they were. They should be given different opportunities, whatever it is. That is something where a people leader, an empowered people leader, should have authority,
Yeah.
because they need to be able to set the people practices and the people strategies of, this is how we're going to be treating people. And if you're not going to be treating people, then as a manager, you're actually accountable to the company, not just to your bottom line or to your KPI.
So you nailed it, because I do believe as an HR, I have the power to influence um, the people I support. So my business units, the business partners I support, the leaders, and so on. And I think this is where that disconnect has happened with many HR professionals, is that they don't see, and I'm just speaking from my experience and my perspective, that a lot of times I've seen HR professionals not seeing themselves as the influencer. They're seeing themselves as puppets. They see themselves as policy driven, and they're there to police policies. And I've had many employees even say this to me, that you're not a typical traditional HR where you're going around policing people. I'm like, I'm not here to police, right? And now going back to that story that you were sharing from my earlier days, I was an HR assistant when a manager, like I think 3 days prior, was praising these new hires, and then I think within a week or within 5 days, he's like, I want to terminate. And I just want to highlight, I was an HR assistant, junior, starting my career. When I stood up, it's like, I'm not going to say I stood up. What I did was I asked the right questions. I asked him, okay, why do you want to terminate? So I had that dialogue with him to understand why he wanted to terminate the same people that he was praising 2, 3 days ago. He couldn't come up with any good reason other than, I think there was one thing they were doing he didn't like. And I was like, okay, but we have a whole process, right? We have a 90-day. Show me the onboarding that I gave to the manager. Show it to me. Show me that. He didn't have it. He didn't want to do it. He's like, no, just terminate. And I was like, I'm not terminating. So I was an assistant standing up to a manager because what he was doing was wrong. You can't run around one day you're happy, so everyone's good, and the day you're not happy, then everybody gets fired, right? That's how you end up creating toxic work environments. So I stood up to this manager, and he didn't like what I had to say, so of course he's going to go to my boss. Okay? So here's where I really want to highlight, I want people to pay attention, is I report into somebody. Now, if my manager, I had a great boss who stood his ground and supported my decision. And that's where the trick is, right? Say you made a decision and then your manager overwrites your decision and didn't support you. I think that's where then the power can get lost. But in that situation, my manager supported me because he believed I was right. And he also said, you can't do this. He didn't like that answer, so he went to his boss, which was the director of our facility, right? We all reported to this director. But she also said, no, Gurpreet's right. You can't just one day hire this and next day you terminate people. It doesn't work like this. We have a system in place. You got to follow the system. And she's right in the sense that, and I also said, like, if you fire somebody, there's lawsuits, there's cost involved. You just can't go firing people. So so I had support. Did that manager like me after? No, he didn't. But so this is the early year of my career, and I learned that very valuable lesson that day, was that we are not puppets. We're not just policy people. We should be true business partners that help managers make the right decision. That is a benefit for the entire organization, not just for the manager. And the hiring and firing is a big cost to the organization. So yes, I believe we have the power to influence managers, but I think ultimately it comes down to the individual as an HR professional. If you don't see yourself that you have that power and you can influence decisions, then you're never going to have that power. But if you see yourself as somebody that can influence people, you have that power, because that's how I built my entire HR career from the get-go, that I'm going to speak up. I have that power to speak up, but it's also the way I do it. So another recent example would be, let's take like newcomers. A lot of companies don't want to hire new immigrants because they don't have Canadian experience. But I can sit there and say, okay, I'm not, I'm going to overlook all the newcomers that have no Canadian experience, zero experience, and now I'm a puppet. But instead, what I did was, I go, okay, let's have a dialogue. Walk me through why you think someone who doesn't have Canadian experience will not be a good fit for you. So I got the manager to walk me through all the stuff that what was going on in his head for why he thinks no Canadian experience, person with no Canadian experience will not be able to do the job. And what that dialogue allowed us to do was pinpoint why he was so hesitant against hiring anybody that had zero Canadian experience. And all it came down to was he had some fears. And then what I did with that was, I'm like, well, why didn't you look at this way? Somebody who has the ability to leave comfortable life and come to a new country. That takes guts and start all over from scratch, from zero, right? Like, let's look at what's happening. And then, long story short, he overcame that, and he's like, you're right. I should be looking at what they can do for me, and so on. I think we do have power as HR professionals, but again, I'm going to go back to what I've been saying. It all comes down to, do you believe you can influence, or are you just a policy person and policing? And if you think you're just policy and telling people you shouldn't be doing this is a policy, you're breaking the policy, then that's all you're ever going to be, is a policy person. But I like what someone said in your comment. It's being a strategic business partner. That's where the value is, and then you can influence people.
So I want to highlight something about that specific story, though, that I think was really great. One of the reasons why, in my opinion, you were able to make the change that was needed to make. Because you led with curiosity and empathy. Instead of going in and saying to him, what you're doing is wrong, even though you and I both think it's wrong, but you didn't go in and say that to him. You didn't go in and say, you know what, it's terrible, it's racist, it's bad for business. You didn't say any of that. You started with a curiosity and an empathy to understand what's his perspective as a leader. And you used that and understood that to have the influence. You built your own power by having the emotional intelligence to talk to him in this conversation this way. And so it goes back to one of the things that I think sort of is
Actually, I want to interject, because before you move on to the next point, this piece that you just said is so important, because in my career, I've seen so many HR professionals doing this one piece wrong that you just highlighted, is going in and saying, oh, you're racist, or this is discriminatory, right? I've seen so many HR professionals do this in early of my career that I was like, no, this is a wrong approach. And then you end up building those butting head relationships, right? And I just, by other people's mistakes, I learned. So, learning, you can learn from other people's mistakes. When you go into that, no, it's wrong, it's discriminatory, no one's listening, right? But when you go within a different approach, okay, walk me through your perspective on this, why you feel this way. You letting the other person talk and understand their situation and why they feel, then you can say, okay, but how about let's look at it this way, right? Having those conversations, that's where the true power is, I believe.
absolutely. And that's where the influence comes, is person to person. And I think to Andre, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Andre made a point here about hierarchical. It's not a hierarchical authority, is in a pyramid, but it's a flat power source. Now, one thing I will say, that is much like a galaxy, certain bodies carry more gravity than others. So while there is a more of a flat power source and a flatter system than a lot of especially traditional thinking stands for, even so, the gravity that a CEO pulls is a lot wider and stronger than a frontline employee. But I really appreciate this because we're talking also about is grounding it in transparent ethics and values. And I really, I wanted to highlight this point because I really appreciated it. But that's exactly what you're saying is you're not coming in as this authority to slap somebody's hand and tell them how to live. You're coming in to understand them as a human being to then influence them and help them improve their practices so they're a better leader, their company is better off, their people are better off. But one of the things I wanted to say before is when it comes to how much power does HR have and the different variables. So two of the key variables going into it is, like you said, where they stand in the perception of the company and the self-perception. Where the self-perception is of that individual. Is it my job to just be a traffic cop, or is it my job to elevate the people practices so that we can get better work done?
Yeah.
And so that those two aspects are vital. And then that second one, when done effectively, will influence the first one. It will influence how people perceive the department, because if historically it was always the paper pusher sitting behind a desk who only shows up when you get in trouble, and then somebody comes in with a better way, it's going to take time to help change people's hearts and minds. They're not going to be able to come in and just have the influence that they might be able to have in a company that was more open to it. But they can start to change that by earning it. And that's another key point I think that I want to talk about is what you're saying around this the proverbial seat at the table. Right. And HR has been talking about it, the seat at the table enough to literally make you sick about it. But I think a real highlight there is there's a big difference between coming in and saying, I demand a seat at the table because I deserve to be there. And don't get me wrong, I'm not disagreeing with the thought, because I do agree the top people person does belong at the decision-making
Yeah.
table. However, on a human basis, it's received differently when you prove it, when you go out and show, okay, I add value to you as a leader, I add value to you as a frontline person, I add value to you as a manager, and then everybody starts coming to you for answers. That your influence and your power is that much more significantly increased because it's come in a way that you've earned it from a company that most of them don't necessarily see HR that way. As we both know, HR has a PR problem, but a lot of that is very, very well earned.
No comment there. I agree. That's a whole nother topic. I'm pretty sure if we go into that, we're never gonna end up finishing this topic. Um, you brought up some interesting points. Now, seat on the table, I think that's a whole different topic that can be covered on its own. I just want to say that seat on the table is a valuable seat that HR should have. I've seen so many organizations right now struggling with so many different aspects of hiring or hiring the wrong persons or whatever by just not having that executive level HR. So if you have executives like operation executive, marketing executive, sales executive, you should have HR because your organization can't run without people, right? So I agree with having a seat on the table, and I believe there's so much value in that. But you got to see the value before you can have a seat on the table. And if your organization does not see the value in HR for having a seat on the table, don't fight it. Show it. And that's all I'm going to say on that part, because that's how I built my entire career, is by showing what I bring to the table. And then I got invited to be at the table. I never ever had to fight to be on the get a seat on the table. I always, even as an assistant, I had the seat on the table because, again, showing the value. Going back to the power of HR, how much power HR has. Another thing we were discussing offline was culture. And you always said this, culture isn't driven by HR. The power isn't in HR to build culture, right? The power when it comes to like this whole diversity, inclusion, and culture that are the hot topics right now, this is driven by leaders. And if even a HR leader, okay, if there's a leader in the HR space, same thing. But ultimately, this is where we don't have power. We don't have the power to make company 100% perfect culture because we're one department or one person, because culture is a team effort, but ultimately it does stem from the leaders, because how you treat your team is what culture is. In simple terms, that's what culture is. This whole diversity inclusion, same thing. How you make hiring decisions as a manager, as a leader, who you bring onto your team is what's going to determine diversity and inclusion, right? And then the inclusion piece, you as a manager, are you including everybody in your team? Now, inclusion, I think a lot of people, again, this is a whole different topic, but a lot of people don't even understand diversity and inclusion. A lot of this diversity inclusion, which is a different topic we're going to talk about in one of our segments, is it's not being done properly, and it's a whole different topic. So I'm not going to touch that right now. But
Yeah.
power, this is where we don't have power. We can influence to a point. We cannot make managers drive culture if they don't want to. We can't force leaders to lead by example. This is where a lot of times the uphill battle with HR and leaders have always been, is that, hey, listen, if you want X, then you got to lead by example. And this is when I actually did mentally took a break from HR, was 2013, because I just got tired of this battle with managers, um, and me, HR and managers, where we want employees to do this and this and this. Okay, but then you got to do this and this and this. But I don't want to do this. But then you can't have your team to do this. You can't have employees, magically employees are not going to love you. Magically employees are not going to bend backwards for you. They're going to be resistant because how you treat them. And I end up taking, I think, a couple of years off from HR because of this struggle between how managers wanted their employees to act, but failed to recognize their own actions were contributing to their behavior, the way the employees were behaving back on them. So I think that's where we don't have power.
Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, as we're coming up on time, I could probably go into a few hour rant on exactly what you're talking about in terms of the CEO and culture, and how many leadership teams try to absolve culture responsibilities and hand it off to the HR person. The fact that culture is not what you're doing outside of work, it's what you're doing when you're actually working. How are people treated? How are people rewarded? How are people guided? How are they ensured they're in alignment with the work that's being done? These are the things that are actually culture, not, the virtual, happy hour, any things like that. The HR person can only influence the CEO so much. If the CEO decides they want to go down to the Capitol building and be part of the insurrection, then there's nothing the HR person could have possibly done to tell them to stop doing that. It's just not possible. And that's where, again, I talk about, the gravity of some people's behavior is so large that when the CEO acts in a certain way, it trickles down throughout the organization, sometimes faster than others. But I think, this is a really important topic. I think this is one that's dynamic. It's constantly changing. If we had this conversation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would have been different. I mean, I don't even know how many years old. There was an article, where was it, in Fast Company, called "Why Doesn't This HR Department Get Any Respect?" And that is, I think, over 20 years old now at this point, this article. This is not a new topic, but
Exactly.
the thing that gives me hope is that there are more and more CEOs and leaders who are valuing the perspective of the people person,
Yeah.
And there are more and more HR people leaders who aren't stuck to the traditional way of doing things, who are starting to use newer approaches, whether it's around data, whether it's around employee experience, whatever it is, but making a real difference and making a real value.
I agree with you on the sense that this is not a new topic. This has been going on for years. And those that are demanding, any HR that's demanding respect, I just want to end this topic on this note. If you have to demand respect, uh, and then it's going to sound harsh, but shame on you because you're doing something wrong. You shouldn't have to demand respect from anyone or any employee because respect is earned. If you are treating employees like policing and it's all about policies, and I've seen so many bad HR people and I can speak on this. If you are just going and you're doing this wrong and you're 5 minutes late from your break, like you're policing, no employee is going to respect you because you're not treating them like a human being. But when you treat them like a human being and you build those relationships, my biggest thing is get out of the office. I know we're virtual now, so it's a little bit hard, but to have people respect you, you have to give respect first and build those relationships and show that you are open, you're inviting, you are open to people to come talk to you. And that's the biggest takeaway I learned right from my first job from my amazing boss. Was he always was out on the floor talking to people, building those relationships with people, and show them that he is open and invited, that you can come and talk to him. And
So
that's how you build relationships.
I do want one last word on this, because you're talking. Sorry, something in my
Are you okay?
throat. Yeah, sorry. Okay, you know what? Forget it. Forget it. No. I just got something caught in my throat. I just need a drink of water, but it's all good. Forget
Okay.
it.
Are you okay?
Yeah. Just something caught in my throat.
Okay, so let's end it on that because we're going over and Gil needs water. And then, so guys, we'll be back next Wednesday with another great topic. We're gonna stick to 1:30 p.m. So we'll see you guys next week and same time, 1:30 right here. Bye for now.